Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we'll be asking what are the historical, religious and political justification for the creation of a Palestinian state. Warm welcome to the programme, and my guest for today's programme is Peter Baum from Southend Friends of Israel and also Fair Reporting, and his other job is as a representative of the Board of Deputies. Peter, it's great to have you back on the Middle East Report, my friend, and it's always a pleasure to do a programme with you. Can you just tell us maybe some of the activities that you've got involved in recently, because you've got quite a few hats, for example, Southend Friends of Israel, and I know there's quite a number of viewers who watch this programme who are part of Southend Friends of Israel, and also your work with the Board of Deputies, and not forgetting your work with Fair Reporting.
Okay, so you're quite right. It is. I am quite active in pro-Israel activities. And with certainly with the Friends of Israel group, we've run a number of events getting people from not only the Jewish community, but non-Jewish community as well. And what we're attempting to do is to get over the facts about the Israel-Palestinian issue and segregating some of the myths that have become so commonplace in modern day language. We hear words like illegal settlements, Israel being an apartheid state, etc., etc. And use of language is very important when people form opinions about the Palestinian cause. So what we do at Fair Reporting and Southend Friends of Israel is to try and just get over the facts of the issues from a religious, historical, legal perspective in an effort to let people make up their own minds once they're aware of the facts and not the propaganda that is very much attached when we look at output, for example, from the BBC or from various political parties. Certainly on the left wing of the Labour Party, we're seeing a constant flow of propaganda which is so inexplicable and actually fundamentally incorrect. So we try to change those perceptions, we challenge them.
Excellent. And in today's programme, we're really talking about the historical, the religious, the political justification for a Palestinian state. And I know that you put together a case which essentially states there is no justification for a Palestinian state. But let's have just take one step back and let's look at the international community, such as the European Union, such as our own Foreign Office, such as the United Nations, and even those of left of centre in Israel believe that the fundamental solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the creation of a Palestinian state. That has been the mantra that's been put out, certainly since Israel signed the Oslo Accords in 1993 on the lawn of the White House with Bill Clinton, with Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat. And this was seen as the ideal situation to solve that conflict. Before we get onto the real details, do you believe that a Palestinian state will create a lasting peace in the Middle East, as much as the international community believes this is the case?
No, I don't. And the reasons for this are several. If there were elections within the geographical areas that are going to form that Palestinian state, that is the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, if we take Gaza first of all, Hamas are certainly in military, political, economic and legal control of that area. So irrespective of the undemocratic methods they would use to win the election, they would certainly win it. And in the West Bank, despite the presence of the PLA, it's probable that Hamas would have at least 50% of the electoral vote as well. So basically, a Palestinian state would be formulated by an Islamic political entity with a Nazi ideology intent on wiping out not only the state of Israel, but Jewish people worldwide. And if you believe in their manifesto, then any person who does not concede to their Islamic way of life is not a believer in the way they practice Islam, would equally not be worthy of living on this planet, but they would let them live, providing they were subservient to their Islamic ideology. So I think the idea of a Palestinian state in today's environment would be absolutely an absurdity.
No, which leads us on to look at some of these issues. And before we go into looking at some of the religious and the historical and the political justification of why there shouldn't be a Palestinian state, let's have a look at this excellently produced video from Prager University that really identifies why there isn't a Palestinian state so far.
If Israel just allowed the Palestinians to have a state of their own, there would be peace in the Middle East, right? That's what you hear from UN ambassadors, European diplomats, and most college professors. But what if I told you that Israel has already offered the Palestinians a state of their own, and not just once, but on 5 separate occasions? Don't believe me? Let's review the record. After the breakup of the Ottoman Empire following World War I, Britain took control of most of the Middle East, including the area that constitutes modern Israel. 17 years later, in 1936, the Arabs rebelled against the British and against their Jewish neighbors. The British formed a task force, the Peel Commission, to study the cause of the rebellion. The commission concluded that the reason for the violence was that 2 peoples, Jews and Arabs, wanted to govern the same land. The answer, the Peel Commission concluded, would be to create 2 independent states, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs, a 2-state solution. The suggested split was heavily in favor of the Arabs. The British offered them 80% of the disputed territory, the Jews the remaining 20%. Yet, despite the tiny size of their proposed state, the Jews voted to accept this offer, but the Arabs rejected it and resumed their violent rebellion. Rejection number 1. 10 years later, in 1947, the British asked the United Nations to find a new solution to the continuing tensions. Like the Peel Commission, the UN decided that the best way to resolve the conflict was to divide the land. In November 1947, the UN voted to create 2 states. Again, the Jews accepted the offer, and again, the Arabs rejected it. Only this time, they did so by launching an all-out war. Rejection number 2. Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria joined the conflict. But they failed. Israel won the war and got on with the business of building a new nation. Most of the land set aside by the UN for an Arab state, the West Bank and East Jerusalem, became occupied territory. Occupied not by Israel, but by Jordan. 20 years later, in 1967, the Arabs, led this time by Egypt and joined by Syria and Jordan, once again sought to destroy the Jewish state. The 1967 conflict, known as the Six-Day War, ended in a stunning victory for Israel. Jerusalem and the West Bank, as well as the area known as the Gaza Strip, fell into Israel's hands. The government split over what to do with this new territory. Half wanted to return the West Bank to Jordan and Gaza to Egypt in exchange for peace. The other half wanted to give it to the region's Arabs, who had begun referring to themselves as the Palestinians, in the hope that they would ultimately build their own state there. Neither initiative got very far. A few months later, the Arab League met in Sudan and issued its infamous 3 no's. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. Again, a 2-state solution was dismissed by the Arabs, making this rejection number 3. In 2000, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak met at Camp David with Palestinian Liberation Organization Chairman Yasser Arafat to conclude a new 2-state plan. Barak offered Arafat a Palestinian state in all of Gaza and 94% of the West Bank, with East Jerusalem as its capital. But the Palestinian leader rejected the offer. In the words of U.S. President Bill Clinton, Arafat was here 14 days and said no to everything. Instead, the Palestinians launched a bloody wave of suicide bombings that killed over 1,000 Israelis and maimed thousands more on buses, in wedding halls, and in pizza parlors. Rejection number 4. In 2008, Israel tried yet again. Prime Minister Ehud Olmert went even further than Ehud Barak had, expanding the peace offer to include additional land to sweeten the deal. Like his predecessor, the new Palestinian leader, Mahmoud Abbas, turned the deal down. Rejection number 5. In between these last 2 Israeli offers, Israel unilaterally left Gaza, giving the Palestinians complete control there. Instead of developing this territory for the good of its citizens, the Palestinians turned Gaza into a terrorist base from which they have fired thousands of rockets into Israel. Each time Israel has agreed to a Palestinian state, the Palestinians have rejected the offer, often violently. So if you're interested in peace in the Middle East, maybe the answer is not to pressure Israel to make yet another offer of a state to the Palestinians. Maybe the answer is to pressure the Palestinians to finally accept the existence of a Jewish state. I'm David Bragg, Executive Director of the Maccabee Task Force for Prager University.
Excellent presentation in terms of the truth regarding the so-called 2-state solution. Peter, I think you very much want to talk really about the religious so-called justification of a Palestinian state. And if we really put this in context, that back in 2005, the Palestinian Authority had parliamentary elections in which Hamas won in Gaza and also under their control within Judea and Samaria within the Palestinian territories. And there was a great danger then, and that was the first time an indicator that if Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinian Authority and Fatah made a peace agreement with Israel, then the likelihood that he would lose in any presidential elections or parliamentary elections to Hamas, or that Hamas would take over in a coup d'etat, bringing about another Islamist state in the Middle East with a dangerous and deadly ideology. But can you explain to us what are the so-called religious justification for the Palestinians to actually control East Jerusalem as their capital and also for a Palestinian state?
Yes, of course. And this question, Simon, is fundamental to everyone who wants to increase their knowledge and understand the truth about the Israel-Palestinian issue. Hamas being a fundamentalist Islamic group, and as we stated, if one reads their charter, it definitely has a Nazi ideology attached to it. In fact, it copies many of the things from Hitler's Mein Kampf in terms of quoting the protocols of the Elders of Zion, how worthless Jewish people are and need to be exterminated, etc., etc. But given their powers within the Palestinian world, and the way that they are educating their children to believe in their charter, it's rather ironic that when it comes to Jerusalem and Palestine, neither of those 2 words, those geographical areas, are ever mentioned in the Quran at all. Now let's just think about this. Given their connection to the Quran and always quoting the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad, isn't it incredible that within the Quran, and I'm going to repeat it for the sake of the people in the audience who would be very surprised at this, neither the words Palestine nor Jerusalem are mentioned in the Quran at all. So from a religious perspective, the Islamic/Palestinian claim to the land of Israel does not stack up. The one tenuous claim that Islamists have to Jerusalem is simply this, that it is suggested that the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven via the Dome of the Rock. Given that the Dome of the Rock was constructed after his death, and given that he also was supposed to visit the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which was constructed some 100 years after his death, you can see from a historical timeline perspective, the facts don't support the claim. But nevertheless, young Muslim children have been inundated with the propaganda that the Palestinians have this great connection to Jerusalem and to the Holy Land, the State of Israel. In fact, from a religious perspective, they do not. And wouldn't it be interesting, Simon, if every imam, not only in the United Kingdom but worldwide, if every father or mother of the Muslim faith started telling their children, hey, you know what, kids, Palestine or Jerusalem are never mentioned in the Quran, so I'm not sure where we get this link from. No one, to my knowledge, whenever I see an imam interviewed on the television or an Islamic scholar or a politician for that matter, never makes the disconnect between the facts, but only makes a connection between fiction.
So, Peter, why is it then that we hear that within Islam that they consider Jerusalem the most third most holy site of place of worship in the Islamic faith, after Mecca and Medina?
Yeah, why indeed? I can find no texts, and my research has taken me being boringly disciplined within the internet, etc., and reading books, but there is nowhere that suggests that Jerusalem in the hierarchical structure of important cities to Islam ranks as number 3. I can't find anywhere other than recent Islamic propaganda. And when we come on to the next point about the history, I think that will be brought out even further.
So just going back to the issue of the Islamic justification for support for a Palestinian state and for Jerusalem to be in Muslim hands, isn't there a great danger, particularly as we're seeing that the Egyptians, prior to that, the Palestinian Authority, at the same time as they're trying to say that this is an Islamic city, Jerusalem, and it's important to their faith, and yet a couple of things. Firstly, when they pray, they turn their back on Jerusalem, pray towards Mecca and Medina. Secondly, the other interesting fact regarding Jerusalem as well is that it was only really since the Six-Day War in 1967, when Jerusalem fell back into the hands of Israeli sovereignty, did they start caring about Jerusalem. Thirdly, we see that they play football and they have barbecues up on the Temple Mount, up where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is and the Dome of the Rock, which considers it doesn't seem to be that holy anyway. And I suppose the other one is that we're seeing a fundamental attack on Jewish history and the Jewish claims archaeologically with the first and the second temple being built there that links Jerusalem to the Jewish people.
Indeed. So just expanding on your statements, the only time, to my knowledge, where Jerusalem has had any relevance or importance to Islam is when it's been in the hands of the Jewish people. When it was in the hands of the Ottoman Empire from 1517 to the end of the First World War, Jerusalem was a rundown place. Infrastructure was falling apart. There was no so-called Palestinian or Islamic movement to reclaim the city, and it just fell into disrepair. It's only in the Six-Day War in '67, when the Israelis took control of Jerusalem, that all of a sudden it had become important in the eyes of the Arab Islamic world.
Let's talk a little bit now about maybe some of the historical justifications for a Palestinian state, and it might surprise an awful lot of people, and I know your answer is going to maybe shock a few people, other people it won't, but has there ever been an Arab-Palestinian state? And can we name their president? Can we name who they had as their head of state? What currency did they use? What stamps did they use? I'd like you to answer that question, Peter.
Well, it's a simple answer, Simon. Of course not. In fact, it's got to the point of being so absurd. If we really go back in history, the first time that the name Palestine ever came into the historical literature was when in the Bar Kokhba, the fall of the Bar Kokhba revolution, 132 to 135 AD, and the Roman Emperor Hadrian, in order to ensure the disconnection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, renamed the geographical area that we would know as Judea and Samaria, Eretz Yisrael as well, as Palestina. Now, why did he choose this name for this geographical area? It was simpler. Palestina in Latin, in Hebrew, Pleshtim, actually means foreign invader or conqueror. And it was named after the Philistines, who originated from Asia Minor and were the enemies of the Jewish people for a period of time. So that's when the name Palestina first came into effect, about 135 AD. The Palestinians were not a race, were not a culture. They have no separate language. They have no separate religion. And perversely, the letter P, or the sound of the letter P, there is no sounding letter P in the Arabic language, which is spoken by all Palestinians. So the idea that a country called Palestine should be created because it belongs culturally, racially, religiously, historically, politically to a certain genre of Arabic-speaking peoples is just a nonsense. All the Palestinians are a hodgepodge of various political parties originating from regions such as Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and even parts of Europe such as Bosnia-Herzegovina, or what was known as Bosnia-Herzegovina. So no, there is, from a historical perspective, there is no justification at all for a Palestinian state based on cultural, religious, racial connections.
Let's have a look at this excellent presentation, which is called The Truth About the Palestinians.
We often hear these historical claims about the Palestinians.
منذ 5000 سنة والفلسطينيون في هذه الأرض.
سيدنا المسيح عليه السلام هو فلسطيني بامتياز.
In a highly politicized debate, it's worth asking, what's fact and what's fiction? The name Palestine was created by the Roman Emperor Hadrian. During his rule, Hadrian massacred the rebellious Jewish population in the Kingdom of Judea and sent most of the remaining Jewish population into exile. Hadrian was determined to obliterate thousands of years of Jewish presence in the land of Israel, going back to the time of the Bible. Archaeological evidence demonstrates a continuous Jewish presence beginning in 1300 BCE. And so, he decided to rename the province of Judea, Syria Palestina, after the nemesis of the Jews, the Philistines. The Philistines were an ancient people that, like many others, had vanished over time and have no connection to today's Palestinians. While Hadrian exiled many, the Jews have maintained a continuous presence in the land of Israel ever since, building strong communities in Jerusalem, Safed, Hebron, and Tiberias over the years. Judea was the last independent state that existed in the land. Century after century, the remaining Jews, as well as other groups, lived under the rule of successive foreign empires that called the area by different names. But in Europe, the Roman word Palestina remained the geographical term that was used most frequently. So when the land fell into the hands of the British at the end of World War I, they named it Palestine. The League of Nations, a predecessor to the UN, granted the victorious World War I powers mandates to control the Middle East and prepare the local peoples for independence. This area came under the British Mandate of Palestine. Two populations lived under the Mandate of Palestine, Arab and Jewish. While the Arabs, for the most part, preferred to see themselves part of Greater Syria, the Jews adopted their new association as residents of Palestine. And so, the Jewish-founded Palestine Symphony Orchestra would, upon Israel's independence, become the Israeli Philharmonic. The Anglo-Palestine Bank would become the Israeli Leumi Bank. And this poster, that is often used today to support anti-Israel arguments, was in fact a Zionist ad promoting tourism to the Jewish homeland in Palestine. In 1947, the mandate expired, and the UN decided to split the land into independent Jewish and Arab states. The Jews accepted the UN resolution and called their state Israel. The Arab world, however, rejected the two-state plan, and right after the last British soldiers departed, attacked their newly independent neighbor. They wanted to eradicate the Jews in Israel. Against all odds, the Jewish people in Palestine, without a regular army or an air force, were able to defeat all of the Arab armies who came to destroy them. After the war, Jordan annexed the West Bank, and Egypt took over the Gaza Strip, both areas that had been assigned to the Arabs as part of the partition plan. Neither country saw a need to set up an independent state in these areas. As a result, an Arab state did not materialize in the former British Mandate of Palestine. In 1964, the Arab League founded the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization. This was the first time this Arab group, that previously defined themselves as Syrians and Egyptians, started naming themselves the Palestinian people. The PLO demanded the entire area of the mandate, though it called for the destruction of Israel, but did not challenge Jordanian and Egyptian rule. Arab aspirations continued to focus solely on eliminating the State of Israel and killing all of the Jews who lived there, instigating another war in 1967, in which Israel gained control over the former Mandate territories in the West Bank and Gaza. So, are these historical claims about the Palestinians true?
لم تمر حقبة في التاريخ خلت من وجود الشعب الفلسطيني في هذه الأرض.
السيد المسيح كان الفلسطيني الأول الذي عذب في هذه الأرض.
No, these claims are false. The name Palestine was only created in 134 AD, and the Arab population that lived in Israel during the British Mandate only started calling themselves Palestinians in 1964. But what about Jesus being a Palestinian? Jesus, in fact, was a Jew living in the Kingdom of Judea.
That was superb, and you can't argue with facts. So, it's important that we understand history, but we also know our facts, and, therefore, this presentation really says there was no such thing. or as a Palestinian people, and this is how it was invented in the modern era, which Peter's here to discuss. Peter, I mean, if we take, for example, the Ottoman Empire, which controlled the Holy Land from 1517 till the liberation by General Allenby in December 1917 during the First World War, did the Ottomans ever help to prepare an Arab-Palestinian state during their occupation of the Holy Land?
No, there was no need to, because history tells us that during that 400-year period, there was no Palestinian movement, there was no Palestinian uprising, there were no Palestinian political parties, there were no Palestinian dynasties, etc., etc., etc. Palestinians as a culture, as a race, as a people, did not exist. And the Jerusalem was completely unimportant to Islam during that 400-year period. So much so that it was left in disrepair. The infrastructure was awful. Now, we have testament to this. In the late 1860s, the famous American writer Samuel Clemens, or Mark Twain, in his book *The Innocents Abroad*, did a tour of the Holy Land, and if I remember the quote correctly, there was not a solitary village or person for an area of 30 square miles apart. And the reason for that, Simon, was the actual landmass of Israel. The Ottomans had allowed it to deteriorate so badly that the south of the country was pure desert and the north of the country was swamp. It wasn't until through Zionism in the late 19th century, as a result of the pogroms, the Dreyfus Affair, and the barbarity of the Russians, that Jewish emigration from Eastern Europe to Israel took hold. And the Zionists at the time managed to buy much of the land after the fall of the Ottoman Empire to develop. And it was on the back of Jewish development that an influx of Arab people started pouring into Israel. They were nothing more than economic migrants, but on the back of Jewish development and Zionism. So right up until, as that film showed, right up until 1964 or 67, there was no concept of a Palestinian movement, a Palestinian people. The world at large believes that these Palestinians were there from time immemorial and they have a right to the land of Israel. Historically, there is absolutely no justification because there is no Palestinian genre, no Palestinian people, no Palestinian religion, no Palestinian culture.
Peter, why did the British call it Palestine? Because we know that once General Allenby and his forces actually defeated the Ottoman Turks during the First World War, fell under British military control. Then we saw the formation and the creation of the League of Nations, which gave the British what was known as the British Mandate of Palestine, as well as modern-day Iraq, and the French-controlled Syria and Lebanon as part of the French Mandate, which is all connected to the Sykes-Picot Agreement that was made between the British and the French to carve up the Middle East during World War I if they defeated the Ottomans. And also at that time, wasn't it, that the Jewish people were identified as the Palestinians?
You're absolutely right. In fact, at the time, the Palestine Post was the Jewish newspaper and became the Jerusalem Post. The Anglo-Palestine Bank was the Jewish bank that morphed into Bank Leumi, I believe, and even the Palestine Symphony Orchestra was a Jewish orchestra. postage stamps at the time actually not only had Palestine on them, but also Hebrew writing, basic Eretz Yisrael. So the actual terminology of Palestine is more associated with Jewish people than it is with Arab or Islamist people. So how ridiculous that the Palestinians, the Arabs, the Muslims, the Islamists should associate themselves with the name of the state of Palestine. It is a complete propaganda trick. And hopefully with programs like this and with educating people out there via programs like this, we will start to get our message across. We're having quite a lot of success in that area as well. I think people are not altogether buying into the fact that the Jews are the aggressors or the oppressors and are running an apartheid state. Quite the reverse.
Absolutely. Peter, I think we also have to address really where the concept of Palestinian national identity took place. I mean, probably we saw kind of brief, looking back in history, you got a book written by a guy called Antoninus called The Arab Awakening, which began to talk about Palestinian nationalism, but at the time it was just Arab nationalism. But then later on, particularly in 1964, with the help of Abdel Nasser of Egypt and also the Soviet Union, we started to see the conception of the PLO, which became the Palestinian Liberalization Organization, which then was created as a terrorist entity, but also as a means of creating a Palestinian identity as well. And this was prior to the Six-Day War of 1967. So can you tell us, for example, the influence that the Russians had, the influence that the Egyptians had, particularly on Yasser Arafat, to actually create this, what is effectively a lie known as the Palestinian people?
Yeah, okay, so all the historical evidence points to the following. The concept of there being a separate identity for a Palestinian people began in the mid-60s with the assistance and influence of what was then the old Soviet Union, who were losing influence in their own particular area. We saw the uprisings in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, etc., etc. So the methodology that the Soviets used to regain some of their influence was to promote and to sponsor various terrorist groups, such as the Red Army Brigade, the Red Army faction, etc., etc. One of the groups they sponsored and helped was the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. And it was from that part of the mid-60s where the first recognition of a Palestinian people began. Prior to that, Simon, there is absolutely no historical evidence whatsoever of there being a people, a genre, a race, a religion that would associate itself with, from an Arab perspective or a Muslim perspective, with Palestine. In fact, as you've already mentioned, Palestine was more associated with the Jewish people of the time rather than the Arabs. So from the mid-60s, the idea took hold and has grown incredibly through some, let's be honest with ourselves, some magnificent propaganda and public relations, and also, Simon, not forgetting that even amongst the Christian world, especially on the left-wing political side, anti-Semitism has taken root. In fact, as we all know, in the Second World War, Jewish people had to be afraid of a right-wing ideology. In today's era, left-wing and right-wing meet when it comes to anti-Semitism.
Peter, I think we also got to look and address the actual PLO and their use of unsavoury tactics in order to bring about support for the creation of a Palestinian state, and particularly the use of terror tactics. I think if we take ourselves back to the late 1960s and the early 1970s, we see that the PLO particularly used terrorism as a means of trying to meet their political objectives. For example, hijackings of aircraft that we saw, attacks on prominent politicians and others right across Europe as a means of persuading European governments to get behind the Palestinian cause. How much part did terrorism play in convincing the Western world to support the Palestinian demands of a creation of a Palestinian state?
Whilst those terror tactics were only aimed at Israel, it commanded huge support. But let's not kid ourselves, Simon. It wasn't for the sake of just political backing. There were economic reasons why the PLO gained so much support. And it's simply this. At the time, there was a united Arab front supporting the PLO and being anti-Israel. The Arabs used the oil weapon in order to gain support from a whole variety of countries who previously had been sympathetic to Israel. Certainly in Africa, where the Israelis had made some tremendous headway with helping African nations with their agricultural needs. But as soon as the oil price went up, some of the African governments, unfortunately, went from being very pro-Israel to anti-Israel because of the economic factors. Isn't it ironic, Simon, that where we are now, the Arab world is in turmoil, fighting against each other, and Israel just recently is making some tremendous strides back into the African continent with the help of agriculture and military assistance as well. So you're right, at the time, the PLO gained huge support from European governments and governments in Latin America and Africa as well. But that was when the oil weapon was used and where the Arab nations themselves had a united front, which they certainly don't have now.
And also, the PLO really embraced the hard political left as well. So they were part of those left-wing revolutionary organisations, and this is why they cooperated, and we saw that with probably the horrendous terrorist attacks and also the number of plane hijackings in the 70s. But if we move on to the 1990s, because this is probably the most significant point when the concept of a Palestinian state came into being, was with the signing of the Oslo Accords between Yasser Arafat and the then Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. And it seems very much from documentation that this was actually effectively a unilateral withdrawal from Judea and Samaria, dressed up as a peace process. Yeah, and maybe you can explain that did the Palestinian leadership under Yasser Arafat generally want to live side by side with Israel in peace, or was this used as a means to carry out a terror war against Israel to undermine her very foundations as a state?
That's a very interesting point, Simon, and it goes back to the old saying, the Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. The truth of it all is, despite all the research that has been done into this, the truth has yet to come out. I don't know. It could be that pressure was put on Arafat at the time by various Arab governments not to make a peace agreement with Israel, because they believed, the Arab world still believed, that by using these continuous terror tactics, eventually there may be another war in which Israel would lose, etc., etc. We just don't know the answer to that. My gut feeling is that Arafat did not want a peace agreement to be concluded with Israel at that moment in time because of the pressure that was put upon him by various Arab governments.
And finally, Peter, I think we have to look at the viability of a Palestinian state as it now stands today. If the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu were to reach an agreement with his counterpart of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, and we see the creation of a Palestinian state in the biblical heartland of Israel, known as Judea and Samaria, do you think there would be peace, and could this Palestinian state actually survive?
No, Simon, how could there be peace? Even if that process was started today, there have been 2 generations of Palestinian children who have been inundated with anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, anti-gay, anti-American propaganda. How do we change those mindsets from a peace process that's going to start today? I think it will take at least a generation. Some of my colleagues think it will take at least 2 generations before we even begin on that process. And if there is to be peace, it has to come from the Islamic, Muslim, Arab side. They are the focal point, not the Israelis. The responsibility, the onus is on the Arabs and the Muslim world to start changing their behaviour, start changing the way they indoctrinate their children.
Also strategically as well, because Israel is so small in its geographical size, and particularly if then Hamas controlled the Judean hills, there'd be a great danger, wouldn't there? For example, what we see now in Gaza with Hamas firing rockets and missiles into Israel, that this would be magnified almost tenfold right across the whole length and depth of the state of Israel.
You're right, and of course Hamas are being sponsored by Iran, and we have yet to see how the Sunni-Shia differences in the Arab world are going to play out. At the moment, from an Israeli perspective, it's clear that Israel is being supported by the Sunni Arab states. We know that there is a cooperation of sorts between Saudi and the other Gulf states other than Qatar with Israel, and we're seeing the divide with Iran and the Shia states, probably now Iraq and Qatar, on the other side. And we've yet to see how this is going to play out, to see what action politically Israel is going to take.
Peter, we have to kind of very much wind up this programme. I think you've given an excellent presentation. We've got 2 minutes left of the programme. So I have to ask you really that you've created a presentation looking into whether the Palestinians have a moral, a political, legal and historical right to a Palestinian state. And for those who are interested, you're prepared to talk to churches and other pro-Israel groups and organisations throughout the country on this.
That's absolutely right, Simon. I've given a couple of lectures. It's gone down well, and all we want to do is to segregate the fact, prove the fact and segregate the fiction, and I think people's minds would be changed on this issue.
Excellent, because I think it's very important that we actually address this issue. But it also goes to show what kind of facts and information, for example, the British Foreign Office getting, the European Union, the United Nations, in deciding, yes, we'll support a Palestinian state. This is the answer to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and this is the means to achieving peace. I think in your presentation today, you've made it very clear that that's unlikely to happen.
That's absolutely right. Not for a couple of generations, anyway.
Peter, I just want to thank you so much for being my guest on today's Middle East Report.
Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure to have you back on the programme. Thank you.
Thank you indeed.
And I just want to thank you for watching today's programme, where we've discussed the viability of a Palestinian state, which is the international community's solution of solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. However, when we look at this in more detail and we start to see that it starts to unravel at the seams, because we realise there is no legitimacy to a Palestinian state, and the great danger is that Hamas would take over the Palestinian Authority and Israel would be left next to a dangerous Islamist state on her doorstep would actually threaten her very survival. So it's important that we proclaim the truth of Israel's situation and we educate ourselves regarding the facts. So we leave you with this song in dedication to the great state of Israel. So thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.
שאו שערים ראשיכם והינשאו פתחי עולם ויבוא מלך הכבוד. Lift up your heads, you gates, be lifted up, you ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. מי זה מלך הכבוד? אדוני עזוז וגיבור, אדוני גיבור מלחמה. Who is the King of glory? The Lord, strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. שאו שערים ראשיכם ושאו פתחי עולם ויבוא מלך הכבוד. מי הוא זה מלך הכבוד? אדוני יזוז וגיבור, אדוני גיבור מלחמה, אדוני צבאות, הוא מלך הכבוד. שאו שערים ראשיכם והינשאו פתחי עולם ויבוא מלך הכבוד. מי זה מלך הכבוד? כל כלי יוצר עלייך ישראל לא יצלח, בכל לשון תקום איתך למשפט תרשיעי. זאת נחלת עדבי אדוני, וצדקתם מתי נאום אדוני. No weapon formed against you, Israel, will prosper, and every tongue that accuses you in judgment you will condemn. This is the inheritance of the servants of Adonai, and their vindication is from me, declares Adonai.